Hello, baby. Did you miss me?
I swear, every time I start feeling like I'm finally getting sick of playing first-person shooters, something new comes out and just brings me right back in. This time though, I've got a pretty good reason because it's a remaster for one of my all-time favorites with Quake 2, developed by id Software and Night Dive Studios.
Yes! Hell yeah! Hey, come on, baby! Come on! Yes! Come on!
And a big thanks goes to Bethesda for giving me early access to this thing, which means I've been able to play through it for the last week or so. Outside of a relatively unknown remaster that came packaged with Quake 4 and that RTX tech demo, very little has been done throughout the years to keep this thing in the spotlight. Well, all that's about to change and there's going to be a whole lot more Quake 2 fans real soon. Quake 2 and to a lesser extent Quake 4 has always been like the black sheep in the franchise, hated on for various reasons, mostly I think by people who never even played it until a few years back, or base all their opinions on what a YouTuber tells them, but still hated on all the same. I'm not going to sit here and fully review Quake 2 all over again though, because I think most people know what it's about anyway, but even if you don't, it's not too hard to sum up. Basically, in the future, Earth was attacked by an alien race called the Strogg, a cybernetic species that harvests conquered civilizations and infuses it with their own. So, in retaliation, mankind launches an attack on their home planet, Stroggos, called Operation Alien Overlord. And yeah, for people who know their World War II history, that was also the code name for D-Day, aka the Battle of Normandy, where the US invaded Europe, so yeah, pretty fitting title. All up, it was a futuristic space war combined with body horror and a heavy metal soundtrack, and yeah, it was good. However, for some people, the simple fact that Quake 2 shared its name with another id Software game that had little to no connection with it was seen as some kind of unforgivable sin. And all the new mechanics, features and ideas it introduced and helped to establish for the genre were completely overlooked. Which is weird because it really did feel like a perfect evolution of all of Quake's mechanics. For starters, instead of the whole thing just being level-to-level gameplay, now it was an actual campaign that you played through, with mini-hubs and backtracking, taking you across the planet of Stroggos as this one-man army as you tried to turn the tide of the war for humanity. And this was the way that FPS campaigns ultimately headed. I mean, we had Half-Life and Unreal all coming out around the same time period, and both doing the same thing that Quake 2 did. But yet for some reason, when they did it, it was celebrated, and when Quake 2 did it, it was looked at as a bad thing. Weapons are all based off the archetypes set out in the first game with the shotgun, super shotgun, machine gun and chain gun, the grenade and rocket launcher, along with the hyper blaster and the BFG. Not to mention, it's one of the first FPS games, along with Shadow Warrior, to have a railgun. Enemies seemed a lot more varied too, and returning power-ups like quad damage could be kept in an inventory and used when you actually wanted to use them. So I guess my point is that while Quake 2 might not be a worthy sequel, it is a more than worthy game, and I hope in this new accessible remaster that more people can finally see and admit that. Because Lord knows, man, that they pulled out all the stops here, and even people who've played the game more times than they've said hello to their own family members are still probably going to find some value here in another playthrough. So, ignoring the obvious fact that this remaster makes the game playable on modern systems without any kind of source ports or mods, let's also consider that you've not only got the base game, but also those two expansion packs, with Ground Zero and The Reckoning, developed by Rogue Entertainment and Yatrix Entertainment, the latter who eventually became a part of Treyarch and worked on the Call of Duty series. Also included is an all-new episode by Machine Games, and a fully working port of Quake 2 64, which is a really underrated and underappreciated version of the game that barely anyone seems to talk about. The remaster runs on the Kex engine and comes with a whole heap of visual upgrades, from things like anti-aliasing through to a completely new lighting system. And it's the kind of thing that most people probably won't notice. But for folks who are familiar with Quake 2 and its engine, these things may as well have a goddamn neon sign above them. And while they're not game-changing, they really do make a noticeable improvement on the overall presentation. For instance, all of the cinematics have been entirely redone and brought up to a much more modern standard. And that's a good thing, considering the resolution for those old ones had to be like 240p.
appreciate what you're showing me right now.
There's an entirely new dynamic lighting system which comes into great effect during gameplay, showing off some really impressive real-time shadows. This is seen to best effect around corners, where there's times where you can outright see the silhouette of a nearby enemy before they've even come into your line of sight. And the player's also got their own self-shadow, which does wonders for immersion. This all kind of gave me a bit of a Doom 3 vibe, and there's even times when enemies are more or less hidden in the darkness, and all you see is their glowing robotic eyes. Even just the simple things like shooting enemies with explosive weapons is going to create a light source from the explosion that then casts a realistic back shadow on the surrounding area. There's also light where there wasn't light before, with some really nifty little areas here and there that take full advantage of this new engine. Compared to that RTX mod for Quake 2, which really was just a bit of a tech demo and completely changed how some of those levels feel, the lighting in this remaster, it feels much closer to that original game's aesthetic. That's a good thing. Just kind of makes me realize just how awesome some of these environments are. And it's always been kind of funny to me how people used to complain about this game being so visually repetitive when it comes to the level design, and also using Quake as a positive comparison. Because, yeah, somehow Quake's never-ending series of brown castles, grey castles, and then brown castles with lava had more variety than all those facilities and locations you see on Strogos. Yeah, righto.
I've been trying to tell your ass.
That's not to say Quake wasn't a looker either, and Quake 2 side by side is like putting Christy Turlington next to Heidi Klum. But it just comes back to that age-old question of, you know, why not both? And how can one thing being good somehow cancel something else out? Also really appreciate how there's the option to turn off texture filtering in the options menu. And I think one of the greatest moments of clarity I've had in my adult life was coming to the realization that texture filtering looks absolutely fucking awful in these older games. I like my textures like I like my women, sharp and vibrant.
And consumable with butter.
It's also kept the most important element of all time, and that's Sonic Mayhem's full soundtrack, which is up there with the absolute best of them when it comes to boomer shooter music. I mean, goddamn son, Quad Damage and Operation Overlord still live rent-free. And it's like Sonic Mayhem dropped two of the dankest soundtracks of all time with both Quake 2 and then Quake 3, and then just dipped completely and dropped off the face of the goddamn earth. Other visual updates include all the modeling for weapons and enemies like they did with the Quake remaster, giving everything a subtle facelift and again, keeping it all in line with the original vision so it doesn't look off-brand.
Yeah, buddy! Lightweight!
They even added in muzzle flash to all the weapons, which was something that people who couldn't think of anything else worthwhile to complain about with the original would always bring up. But what's even cooler than that are the updates to the enemy behaviour, some of which make certain enemy types act completely different. Now, Quake 2's AI was already kind of impressive for its time, introducing this mechanic where enemies could often duck to avoid things like incoming rockets. You'll even see enemies leaping off ledges to get down to the same level as the player, which is something I don't ever recall them doing in the base game. In fact, the only other game I can remember seeing enemies do this was in Kingpin Life of Crime, which, funnily enough, also runs on the same engine as Quake 2. Either way though, man, seeing one of those Strog jump off a walkway to continue the fight on your level is pretty damn awesome. The enemy that's definitely had the biggest upgrade here though are the Berserkers. Now, these are those one-armed freaks that have arguably one of the most iconic sound bites when they encounter the player. And in the original, they were pretty ineffective, just kind of running around and taking a swipe at you if you got too close. But they were easy enough to manage as long as you held your finger on the trigger while moving in the opposite direction. Here in the remaster though, it is completely different. And they've given them this all new attack where they can kind of leap at you from the other side of the room to the point that they're an actual threat. And if 3 or 4 of these assholes start to gang up on you, well, that can spell trouble pretty damn quick. You'll often even see them outright dodging rockets and grenades in real time, like they've turned into Neo from the Matrix.
Shit.
Gotta say though, I'm still not sure if I'm like a complete fan of this leap attack. I mean, it is impressive and all that, but it also seems like the environments don't always accommodate the player to be able to sidestep and avoid it. Some of the levels just weren't designed with that sort of attack in mind. And the way they often teleport across an entire room to hit you is often just flat out bullshit.
Bullshit!
There just doesn't seem to be any way to avoid it, and even if you're not really in range, you often still get knocked back from it. Still though, it is kind of funny how one of the least threatening enemies in the base game has now become one of the most dangerous, just with a few simple updates. The other remaster changes are more just like minor quality of life things, like how items can now be easily accessed through a radial menu that even slows down time when it's open. The effect when using power-ups like quad damage is also completely new, with the player glowing like they've just taken a swim through a pool full of Logan Paul's prime. One of the coolest new additions is the compass, a completely new mechanic which shows a waypoint on the screen as to where you need to go next. Plus there's also damage indicators on screen to show which direction you're getting violated from as well. Both of which are completely optional, alright? So remember, you control the buttons you press. It's just a remaster that feels like it's been made with a whole lot of love, and that's even apparent in all the side content they've crammed into it as well. Like all the random old design documents they've gotten their hands on and scanned into the game. Like old memos and sketches from back in the 1990s, complete with coffee stains on the paper for that true seal of authenticity. It just makes this remaster the absolute best way to play Quake 2, and it really does make all those other versions completely redundant, if just for the fact that you're getting all those extra campaigns added in as well. And truly one of the best things about this remaster is the inclusion of Quake 2 64, which has been lovingly brought over to the PC. Now I'm not sure how many people are familiar with Quake 2 64, but to sum it up, it was a really solid console version of more or less the same game.
One gigantic picture.
You live?
And shared a lot in common with the 64 port for Quake 1, but more importantly, Doom 64 and the awesome Doom port for the PlayStation 1. And you can see that developer DNA right from the opening screen, which has a very similar logo reveal to Doom 64. Now, Quake 64 was really just a heavily modified version of the PC game, with a lot of compromises so that it could run with the limited capabilities of the console, but if that was the only way you could play Quake at the time, well, it could have been a damn sight worse. Probably realizing that people weren't too happy though with playing a heavily gimped version of the same game on PC, they did something different with Quake 2 64 and created this entirely new campaign with its own original levels. And what we got was a pretty damn solid little shooter, and easily one of the best ever made for the 64, because the people who worked on it understood the assignment and tailored the whole thing around the limitations of the hardware. That means that this remaster of Quake 2 64 offers up the most staggering improvements, considering the only way to play this before today was to either use an emulator or to hook up an actual 64 and play through it.
Quake 2 for Nintendo 64 on PlayStation game console.
It is easy to see it as a bit of a glorified mission pack, but there are some notable differences with this version as well. Firstly, you don't have units anymore, comprised of multiple levels. Now it's just one level after the other, with a couple of dozen all up. And you even get this unique little cutscene when you finish one, showing Bitterman from a third-person perspective. You can't hold on to items anymore either, probably because of the limitations of the controller, so these are instant use again, kind of like it was in Quake 1. Visually too, it makes use of a lot more effects like coloured lighting, similar to how both Quake 64 and also Doom 64 looked, giving the whole thing a much more vibrant appearance. And it's actually kind of surprising just how good some of these environments still look. Quake 2 64 is also significantly harder than the base game, mostly due to a much higher enemy count, but there also being far less ammo to accommodate for this. Quake 2 on hard, for instance, is mostly a cakewalk, save for a few tricky sections here and there, but Quake 2 64 is significantly challenging on hard from beginning to end, to the point that it starts to make you wonder if anyone's even playtested it. The irony there too is that the final bosses are probably the easiest part of the entire campaign, despite them being the absolute toughest enemies in the game, because all you really need to do to beat them is circle strafe around and hide every now and then, and they'll barely touch you. Either way though, outside of the mission packs, this is about as ball-bustingly hard as Quake 2 is ever going to get. And it's going to give most people a real run for their money.
Oh, no way!
Instead of the tanks and the tank commanders, this version is flush with the gladiators. Those guys with a claw for one hand and then a railgun on the other. This version also features all these new updated AI behaviors, which means you'll see berserkers defying the laws of nature and performing those superhuman feats to get to you. And then consider too on the 64 that you had to beat all these levels in one go. I mean, back then there were no quick saves or checkpoints, and it's kind of insane to think that people could get through some of these levels without dying once. The only real major downside to this version is that it's really short. Even on the 64, you could probably beat it in around 2 to 3 hours, and on the PC, with the benefit of a mouse and a keyboard, I managed to get through the whole thing in about 90 minutes. The other thing I noticed was that in certain areas, having texture filtering off looked absolutely awful. Like in the mines, for instance, where the ice texture just looks atrocious. And the floor, which is supposed to be ice, looks like barely translucent water. This version is also lacking that soundtrack by Sonic Mayhem, which was a big part of what makes the base game so awesome. And what they've replaced it with is more of a soundscape than a soundtrack. Composed by Aubrey Hodges, who worked on PS1 Doom and also Quake 64, it's the kind of thing that tries to get under the hairs on your skin, you know, as opposed to making them stand up, if that makes sense. Still though, this is easily one of the better versions of Quake 2 out there, and those unique environments are still really impressive. Doubly so too when you consider that all of this ran on that Nintendo 64. So for a lot of people who've never played this version before, it's going to be an awesome little bonus for what's already a package that's got a whole lot of value attached to it. All that's missing now is an updated version of that PS1 port.
Quake 2 for Nintendo 64 and PlayStation game console.
Final piece of the new content puzzle is that new episode developed by Machine Games, who people might remember also created a new episode for the Quake remaster back when that thing came out. The loose idea here is that you have to go through 6 different missions to find data discs, which then give you the location of the Strogg creator. And look, if you just have to have more Quake 2 content, then it's hardly worth complaining about. But I'll be honest, man, I just didn't really think these levels were all that good. I don't know, maybe I was burned out from just playing too much Quake 2 beforehand. I mean, they look great, and you can tell the people who made them know their way around a map maker, but they just go on way longer than they really need to. There's 6 all up, and they're anywhere from 20 to 30 minutes to get through. But because they're full of the toughest, tankiest enemies, it just often feels like manual labor trying to clear everything out. It's like you'll clear out a bunch of tank commanders and gladiators in one room, and then head into the next, and there's another 2 or 3 waiting, and it just becomes so boring. They've even got those variants from the mission packs who have energy shields, which makes it even more spongier, and I genuinely don't believe that anyone even bothered to playtest any of these. The boss fights are even worse, and some of these are just kinda lazy, putting you into these really small arenas and spawning in dozens of standard enemies to contend with at the same time. And look, you know, they're really running out of ways to make a boss fight challenging, when the best they can do is just to try to overwhelm you with all these distractions. More than that though, it's really just the same couple of bosses recycled over and over, like some kind of variant of the other bosses from the mission packs. And after the 5th or 6th time you fought one of these guys, you'll just be begging for the level to come to an end. I mean, even the final level, once you've got all those data discs, is more or less just another boss rush. Yeah, because we haven't fought enough of these guys up until that point. Outside of the visual spectacle, there's nothing really all that new or exciting when it comes to the layouts or the objectives. I kept waiting for there to be some kind of exciting sequence or something that would pull the rug out from beneath my feet, but it never happened. And I just kind of feel like there was so much cool shit they could have added in that no one's ever seen in Quake 2 before. Fancy scripted events that take advantage of this new engine. I don't know, something. But again, I'm just back to finding data discs and running around turning off lasers. There's a few sequences that are a throwback to Quake 1, and another level has the highest enemy count I've ever seen in a Quake 2 map, which, yeah, has its moments, but that's about it. As an example of creating a really detailed environment for a Quake 2 campaign, it's hard to fault, I'll be honest. But I just feel that after playing so many other amazing fan-made mods over the years which do genuinely impressive things, it's kind of hard to just go back to shooting the generic enemies over and over for 20 to 30 minutes. Look, it's not outright bad, and if all you want to do is play through another 3 hours worth of maps that have nothing to do with Quake 2, well, be my guest. I don't know, I guess I was just hoping for something more. But at the end of the day though, id Software and Night Dive Studios have yet again brought an old classic into the modern age. And the fact that it's for one of the most underappreciated shooters of that era is even more of a bonus. Finally, maybe people can stop acting like this is some sort of mediocre shooter and start appreciating it for what it is, along with enjoying some new features and mechanics. Now, if they can only do the same thing for Quake 4, then we'll be all set.